Hello, and welcome to Nancast. I'm Jill, your host. Have you ever stopped to think about how much or how little neonatal medicine benefits from advances in drug development compared to adult care? If you knew there was a significant gap in how medications are designed for newborns, would you feel empowered to speak up, to advocate for research that truly reflects the unique needs of our tiniest patients? Well, today, we're shining a light on this critical gap in neonatal drug development and why it matters for every nurse and APRN at the bedside. Today, we're joined by a fantastic panel of experts who are working at the intersection of clinical care, research, policy, and advocacy to accelerate drug development for newborns. Mary Short, a clinical nurse specialist and former senior research advisor in pediatric capabilities at Eli Lilly and current chair of the International Neonatal Consortium Real-World Evidence Work Group. Dr. Wakako Eklund, neonatal nurse practitioner and NANS liaison to the International Neonatal Consortium, and Dr. Kanwaljit Singh, a physician scientist and executive director of the International Neonatal Consortium at the Critical Path Institute. You might be wondering, how will understanding this topic help me in my day-to-day practice? This conversation will not only give you insight into why so many medications used in the NICU lack neonatal-specific research, but also empower you to become part of the advocacy movement that can drive real change for the safety and future of the babies we care for. Together, we'll explore the current landscape, the barriers to progress, and how nurses and APRNs can become powerful voices driving change for safer, more effective neonatal therapies. Let's get right into it. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Neonatal nurses and advanced practice providers are on the front lines caring for our patients every day. Yet when it comes to drug development, neonates are often the last to be considered. Mary, can you start by giving us some background on the current status of drug development for neonates and how it differs from the adult world?
Sure, thanks for asking. I'd like to begin with just sharing that neonates are an underserved population when it comes to drug development. Most medications that are used in the NICU are still not specifically approved for use in neonates and infants. Good news is we're starting to see a shift with more recognition for the need for dedicated neonatal studies, but the pace is much slower to drug development for older children and adults, and unfortunately less successful. For example, at the PASS meeting in 2024, they have a platform session always on neonatal drug clinical trials. And it really painted a sobering picture, as nearly all of the trials that were presented had either negative or null results. So again, that's emphasizing that they're underserved. They also did not have the same benefit from the legislative impacts. So while there's been progress overall in pediatric drug development, thanks to legislation like the Pediatric Research Equity Act and the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act. Again, neonates have not had that same benefit. And there's a nice graphic if you go out to the FDA's Medical Products for Neonates site, where they talk about the labeling changes that have occurred since 1999 through 2023. And a great milestone was achieved. There are over 1,000 pediatric label changes. But when you drill down in that to what's changed for neonates, there's only been 88 label changes that included any information for neonates. And out of those 88, 69 of those were results from trials that included neonates, and only 65 actually have an indication for neonatal use. And when you look at the products with these label changes, most of them were antimicrobials, antivirals, antifungals, some for diagnostics, some for nutrition, and some for pain, but not really much for neonatal specific conditions. One good news is recently we've had EYLEA for retinopathy of prematurity, so that's encouraging. But the third point I would make about why it's different is, unlike older children and adults, Neonates still have immature organ systems that are rapidly developing, and that affects how they absorb, metabolize, and eliminate medications. So that can make dosing and safety especially difficult. And it requires that we use specialized design, biomarkers, and outcomes that reflect this unique physiology and the vulnerability of this population. But these challenges make neonatal drug development less interesting to the pharmaceutical companies. It just does not fit well into their business models. And a concern that I have that even when companies do the work to obtain a neonatal indication, there might be poor uptake of that medicine. And an example I would share is Cezabe, which had a very difficult launch due to entrenched off-label practices and costs. So all of those points, the fact that they're underserved, they've not benefited by the legislative requirements and incentives, and their unique challenges is a reason why we need very strong advocates for this population.
It is sort of a bleak picture, like you said, and it shows us how we need to be. Nurses need to take an active and unified voice, especially given this current legislative climate. But you mentioned the FDA in your opening and how that's a good resource for nurses. So the FDA recently launched a dedicated resource page for medical products in newborns. What does this mean to the neonatal community? And why is this so important for nurses and APRNs to utilize this in their practice?
So this new FDA resource, it reflects a growing commitment at the federal level to support safe and effective therapies for neonates. So it's giving greater visibility, coordination, and transparency in how medical products are evaluated and developed for newborns. And it will provide a central resource where clinicians, educators, research, industry, and families can find guidance documents, trial updates that directly impact neonatal care. So if you're a nurse and you want to be involved in the research ecosystem, you should be familiar with this site, and you should be able to speak to both the unmet need and the ongoing efforts to accelerate product development for your patients. And this site introduction that's there could be used by bedside nurses as talking points to explain to families why neonatal research matters and how therapies are evaluated to be safe and effective for their babies. If you're a nurse educator, this site will provide you easy access to important guidance documents that will facilitate neonatal research education. And ultimately, this page supports a more informed and collaborative neonatal care environment.
So now we know the current status. And we know that there are resources out there, as Mary mentioned, and we see that there is this unmet need, and there's a lot of gaps that we don't have. How do we move the needle forward? So we need strong policy action, strong advocacy. But Kanwaljit, you had some work that highlighted the advocacy gap for pediatric and neonatal drug development. Why do you think there's such a striking difference in research and investment between adult and the neonatal population?
Thanks so much, Jill, and thanks for having me here. As an introduction, I'm the Director of Pediatric Programs. I basically work on Critical Path Institute's International Neonatal Consortium, which is basically a public-private partnership or consortium comprised of stakeholders from industry, academic researchers, patient members, and most importantly, nursing members too. So we basically work collaboratively and make people who are basically in their day-to-day job, their competitors, each other's competitors basically collaborate with each other and with us to solve some of the most intractable issues and challenges that inhibit drug development in the neonatal field, right? So this is basically what INC is about, and this is basically INC's mission. But then, I've been doing this for almost like 5 years now. I have seen how things have changed in some cases for the better, but in a lot of cases not for the better in neonatal drug development. A lot of large pharmaceutical companies that in the years past had active drug development programs in neonatology are basically divesting themselves from this field. And in some of the others, what's happening is the gap that is left over is basically being filled with by small and medium sized pharmaceutical companies. And those are the companies that do not even sometimes have resources to run their clinical trials properly, let alone do like innovative long-term vision for what is actually needed to make real impact in the field of neonatology. This is actually sad because as time goes on, some of the basic issues and challenges with neonatology, like lack of data platforms, understanding some of the disease physiology related challenges, have actually been improving as science becomes more and more mature, right? What is actually happening in the back end that leads to this sort of disengagement by industry is, I've heard this from a lot of people, that there's this heightened one is there's this heightened risk perception of increased risk. A lot of people don't even want to touch a premature baby admitted in the NICU because they think they'll basically harm the baby or hurt the baby, and it's really bad for their reputation. And nobody wants to have negative news in the media, right? But more importantly, even that is the fact that advocacy, whether it is from patients, parents, and from nurses, is actually not quite as strong and as persistent as you will see in some of the older like fields like Alzheimer's, ALS. Because I work at Critical Path Institute, I've seen how the other programs, adult facing programs, have a very strong advocacy efforts, right? So we go to these conferences in which you will see patients themselves being on the stage and talking to the industry and talking to the regulators and talking to anybody who would care to listen about the challenges that they face as a result of their condition, and how everybody needs to do better. They are real people facing real challenges, and they're not basically just like a number on a spreadsheet, or basically kind of a number on in their budget Excel spreadsheet, right? But when it comes to neonates, that sort of in your face advocacy is actually missing. There are very good reasons why it is missing, because I really do not think that it is going to be possible ever for a premature baby to be on the stage and tell how awful it is, or even adolescents who were born prematurely to tell how bad it was when they were premature, right? It's simply not possible. On the other hand, patients themselves, their parents are basically, they're just basically happy to be out of NICU. Their baby is safe and sound, and they're exhausted, and advocacy is the last thing that enters their mind. So what ends up happening is those babies are basically become kind of premature, invisible, so to speak. They're an invisible population. Anybody except for parents, I guess nurses and physicians who care for them. Nobody ever see those babies outside of the NICU. When they're out of the NICU, the problem that they had in most of the cases is actually gone, right? So because they're invisible, it's very easy to de-emphasize research and drug development in those efforts when times are tough, economy is not doing good, funding is tight, and they have to make hard decisions in terms of what programs they should be funding. Those type of programs are the first to go. That's the sad reality. And when those programs go, for example, this sort of a thing that happened at Pfizer overnight, they shut down their entire pediatric centers of excellence. Do a Google search. You will not see one single Google article or news article that Pfizer shut down their pediatric centers of excellence. On the other hand, I would say 7 or 8 years ago, there was this similar sort of a very high profile incident in which Pfizer basically shut down their center of neuroscience. There were like headlines everywhere. Pfizer shuts down their neuroscience unit and 200 people were fired. None of that. I'm telling you, do a Google search right now. You will see there's absolutely nothing about the fact that Pfizer shut down their pediatric centers of excellence, including their entirety of neonatal drug development, basically is gone. Similar sort of thing happens in the back end all the time. Nobody notices it because, babies are invisible populations. That's basically the issue.
Yeah, the concept of the visible patient is upsetting, but I think this is the time for nurses and, as you said, families even to break that silence, speak up, tell their stories. nurses have incredible stories, and they have the power of storytelling to tell people, this is what's happening, and try to bring these struggles alive, so to speak. Bring that impact factor to say, to the drug developers, to the pharmaceutical companies, like, this is what these families are facing every day. Yes, premature baby does grow up and they're fine and they go home, but the challenges that they face continue. And that's why it's important that, nurses share their voices, encourage families to do the same in order to hopefully change this narrative that we're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. This narrative needs to be changed, and there needs to be a much better advocacy and engagement from both patients and from nurses. Because those are parents themselves are obviously intimately involved, and more than physicians themselves, I would say nurses are the community that interfaces with patients and with physicians both. They're probably even more important than physician facing engagement, advocacy engagement, I would say, because they're the ones that they're most. They will talk to the families, they will talk to the parents all the time, and they would be the ones that convince the parents to participate in research, right? Having engagement and advocacy efforts from nursing side of the things is going to be very, very important.
So let's shift to the reality that nurses see every day in the NICU. Wakako, can you talk to us about these gaps in therapies that we're seeing in the NICU in our daily practice that we might not even be aware of?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having this very special session. And I appreciate NAN's support for me to continue to represent the very large neonatal nursing community. I will just be totally honest with you. Until one day, Mary Short called me years ago in, I believe, 2015, when International Neonatal Consortium was launching that year, to explain to me what this was about. I was already a probably 15-year veteran as a neonatal nurse practitioner, and then 8 or 9 years as a neonatal nurse at a level 3-4 facility prior to that point. But have I ever heard about this dialogue? No. I was completely blown away, and I do believe that even today there are many of my colleagues, your colleagues, who may not have heard anything about the gap that vulnerable neonatal population is faced. And if it were not for Mary Short taking time to be on the phone to really explain about all the federal policies that were trying to incentivize the therapy development in pediatric realm, I was completely ignorant, even though I had a vague suspicion that the medicines I was often administering or even ordering, antibiotics, whatever, that are typically frequently used in NICUs, have not been truly specifically studied for long-term safety or efficacy in that particular neonatal population. Now that I was informed of that, I started to look at my clinical day to day, and sometimes it's gut-wrenching to know that we have to continue to administer medications that have not been fully tested. However, we are more aware, and I think some of the nurses I work with or some of the colleagues I work with, they enjoyed the last NANcast that you and I had a discussion about, was it about a year and a half ago? And just like Mary said, just like Kanwaljit said, that story, the power of a story, and just like you said, the parents' stories, I also find it extremely rewarding to become very close to families to help them understand what the babies are facing. And in my clinical setting right now, we are not one of those high-level clinical trial settings, but many of us NAM members probably are. And it's extremely important that we don't just do a good job as a NICU nurse or neonatal nurse practitioners or whatever the specialty we are in NICU. It's not enough for us to just do a good job, but to step back and look at this scenery, climate that is threatening the neonatal community. And I think as clinicians, we need to be listening to more stories.
Yeah, I think it's unsettling, as you said, that there are drugs that we're administering that haven't been studied on the neonatal population, that we've been administering on a daily basis. Can you help us understand the current state of neonatal drug development and how we can ensure as nurses that we are providing safe and effective medication to this vulnerable population?
Sure. Mary may have a much stronger narratives that she can share, but I think that it is very important as individual clinical person in NICU that within that understanding, within our frame, that we still continue to stick to the recommended dosage and recommended route and how frequently we give, and be vigilant of drawing levels for those drugs that affect the serum level, just because how the baby clears is completely different, depends on the gestational age, kidney function, or how many hours of age that infant is. And that's why we commonly given medications. I often don't have to look at the drug book, but I always tell newer practitioners to always look at the hours of age of the baby and look at the urinary output, look at the schedule for the trough level, or in some places maybe peak and trough are both done. But we must stick to the basic foundation of we need to give it to the right person, right dose. And even as a bedside nurse, you may not give any drug. I mean, you may not write orders for a certain amount, but it is also very good for you to know, why did the practitioner neonatologist order this amount for this baby and not the same amount for the other baby, even though they're twins? Or that baby next to it is just only maybe 4 days older, and why is the frequency different? And I think meticulous understanding of pharmacology to the level that you are able actually helps us to feel safe and keeping up. And I actually love the page that Mary shared about the FDA products for newborn. They have done a marvelous work of writing it to inform at the level that we can understand. It's not written for scientists only. It really is practically written and easily understood. And I hope I'm right, because I read it and I read it again, and not because I didn't understand it, but I wanted to memorize everything that he said so that I can quote it and I have the knowledge in my head if parents have any questions or nurses have any questions.
So, off-label use does not necessarily mean that administering of that medicine in an off-label way is unsafe. What it does mean is that there are gaps in information about the use of that product in that population that potentially put the infant at risk. And as a nurse or a neonatologist, we need to advocate that we're not in the position of having to administer medications to care for our infants without all the information that we need. So again, it doesn't equate to unsafe, but it does equate to gaps in information and things, and that's why we need to advocate for neonatal drug development.
Mary, thank you so much for clarifying that, and I appreciate you informing us and clarifying, because it is true. It's not saying it's unsafe. It's just that all of those other adult drugs have been studied so much more in depth with such information.
We talked a lot about unmet drug development needs. And this is the reality that we're seeing in neonatal care every day. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like day to day in practice and what kind of gaps we're seeing?
In the day-to-day practice, sometimes we get so busy just to give the baby the care he or she needs every day. And the unmet needs sometimes are not as blatantly visible to us. That's the scary thing. I'm still very much immersed in clinical setting at level 3 or level 2. And I really think that when we are running around saving babies or running for deliveries and what have you, we often completely don't see it if we don't stop to think about it. That's the danger, and that's why now we collaborate so much, and Inc. has involved numerous family members whose children had numerous variety of disease conditions as a neonate and also as growing adults, teenagers or young adults. And they actually really, really want more newborn therapy development to advance. They are probably biggest cheerleaders in some ways, even though if they are asked today with their newborn on ventilator and asked, would you be willing to be in clinical trial, especially if you're going to be grouped into the placebo group, that is a dilemma, moral dilemma, and to some it is an ethical dilemma in their mind. But in clinical settings, whether you are at a place where there's no clinical trials going on or not, all of us administer drugs. All of us need something in treatment of these newborns as they go through NICU. That this information about the unmet needs needs to be spoken about, and educational opportunity should be offered so that at least the information is out there. Because I never encountered this discussion or dialogue until I got involved in the International Neonatal Consortium in 2015.
No, I was just about to basically emphasize what Wakako said. Neonatology is basically an acute care setting. Physicians or nurses or basically care providers work in timelines that are basically counted in hours in many cases, which is different from a lot of cases in adult setting. Many conditions are chronic conditions in which actually people have time to sit down and think about the issues and challenges, right? People can plan on how to conduct clinical trials, how to participate in clinical trials, convincing patients to participate in clinical trials. In neonatology, things are, if you miss the initial, for example, in HIE clinical trials, right, you have to have the patients agree to participate in clinical trials within a few hours, right? If you miss the window's gone. It's basically already too late. And other thing that Wakako mentioned about convincing patients to participate when they're asking, there's a 50% chance of getting real drug and only 50% other chances are baby might get actually placebo. That really does complicate the issue in terms of advancing and convincing patients to participate in that clinical trial. So it's a real unmet need. I think there are solutions available. There are, as things, the science of conducting clinical trials have matured. I don't think it is absolutely 100% true that randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials are the only way to do drug development in neonatology, especially because of the fact that a lot of those conditions are very rare. This isn't like you'll suddenly find thousands of patients of a given disease area, right? There are adaptive clinical trials available. There are methods available in which you can reduce the reliance on placebo arms in your clinical trials. So those things are there. I also believe that it needs sort of a bi-directional type of effort on the part of industry to be willing to conduct those modern design of clinical trials, but also on the part of regulators to be a little bit more accepting of those newer ways of conducting clinical trials?
So when you talk about the reality of day-to-day in the NICU, one of the concerns that I have is on medication errors. So medication errors are more common in this population compared to pediatric or adult patients in the hospital, and they're more likely to occur, and unfortunately, when they occur, they are more likely to result in harm. And so, again, the unmet need of having approved drugs for neonates means that children are receiving these medications in formulations that were approved for a different population. So sometimes there's manipulations that occur in order for those to be delivered to neonates. And again, this is really increasing the risk of medical errors. And I am concerned that I don't think this specific issue is discussed enough. I was surprised when I moved to industry that it wasn't a frequent topic of conversation. And again, I think that's where neonatal nurses, who are the individuals who are administering their medications, who theoretically could be a risk to the patient, but also to their own practice, that's where we need to be a strong advocate. So that I would put that in the reality of day-to-day in the NICU. And, I remember myself being concerned about making a medication error. And, you felt like the longer you were in practice, the more likely this was going to happen. And it just does happen. We have to acknowledge that. So I guess that's one of the concerns that I would have in the day-to-day reality of an unmet need.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, that's every nurse's fear or every provider's fear that they're ordering. But you need to use your resources, like Wakako said, look it up in Lexicomp or whatever drug guide your institution uses. Utilize your pharmacist. Like if you have a question, call the pharmacy. They're there to help you. And I think that it's so important, and we all need to just put our egos aside and, ask these questions, because like you said, that's the ramifications of a medication error are so severe. And I know we talked about the FDA as using the FDA as a resource. And Mary, you mentioned it as well. Can you just explain a little bit more, like the link between FDA approval and the actual availability of age-appropriate formulations? And how does that matter so much for us in the NICU? Is that a resource that nurses should be utilizing as well when they're administering medications?
Well, the overall need is to get more approved products so the FDA has the information. But to understand the link between an approved product and age-appropriate formulations. So when the FDA approves a drug as being safe and effective for a specific population, it's based on the clinical trial data and on a formulation that is appropriate for that population. So when we use medications off-label and the formulations that are provided, it doesn't mean that it's approved or appropriate for a neonate. So it could be in a form that's difficult to give safely to a newborn, because what we'd like to see is maybe a liquid formulation that has accurate dosing, that has preservative-free solutions, that's in an appropriate volume that you can actually deliver to your patient. And in the NICU, precision is really critical. I don't need to tell you guys this. A rounding dose common in adults or pediatric patients could be fatal to a newborn. So without age-appropriate formulations, what happens is we manipulate the other formulations, crushing, diluting, mixing them, and that introduces risks for dosing errors. It introduces risks for contamination and for instability. So when an FDA-approved label approves a medication for neonates, it requires a commercially available, tested, and standardized formulation unless the company demonstrates that they just weren't capable of making it. So it's that age-appropriate formulation provides a treatment that we can deliver safely and consistently with confidence in its efficacy. And again, this matters really deeply in the NICU where that margin for error is minimal. And our patients deserve medications that are developed and tested specifically for them. And nurses play a key role here. Again, as I mentioned, you're the ones who are preparing and administering these medications. So having access to age-appropriate formulations suppose safer care for the patient you're taking care of and for yourself in terms of preventing medication errors. So we need your voice.
If I can add a little bit to that, over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, the way pharmacy dispenses any medicine, drug, has been refined with safety concern in mind. And also, in the last several years, electronic order entry has incorporated hefty force of AI programmed into it to remind you that, hey, it's been 3 days. Do you need to change the dose? Or you put this weight, this is too large of a dose. And I do call pharmacy quite a bit when I have any concerns. But again, technology can make a mistake too, just like human. So I'm always scrutinizing that AI that reminds me to do this and do that. But Mary's right, the safety concern, because I actually have been in a unit where baby was fatally harmed because of a major error.
I would just like to add, though, the concept of the unknown unknowns. Because there has been limited drug development in this population, the industry clinical research scientist has limited experience in this population and are unaware of the unknown unknowns. So they don't know what questions necessarily to ask. And your day-to-day in the environment, you just assume that everybody has the same knowledge as you do, and they don't. And so that's where it's really important to share your expertise in standard of care in medication administration in a NICU, which is different than most other places. What's really feasible in a NICU trial, and inform them about the relationship that you have as the trusted source with families. So you're needed because you need to address the unknown unknowns.
I like that concept because you don't know what you don't know. If you're armed with knowledge, that's how we can spark this energy to get more awareness in advocacy.
I'm really framing it from a different perspective. I'm making you aware that the people who are designing clinical trials have limited experience in the NICU. They're the ones that have unknown unknowns. You assume that they know a lot about your practice. They have limited experience. They don't. That's why you need to step up and be sharing your expertise, even maybe when you're not invited initially. I need nurses to understand that they have expertise that can make a difference in the outcomes that we're seeing currently in neonatal drug development trials.
How would you advise a nurse to move forward with that information? What are some of the steps they can do?
Great. So start close to home. You should be aware of the research that's planned or ongoing in your unit, and you need to provide input, even if you haven't been asked. You can help them understand how it can be successfully implemented and how to translate the information in a way for parents that they'll be interested in participation. You can also become more involved in professional organizations like your NAN advocacy group. NAN and A1 right now have a task force to improve outcomes in neonates. And, they need to hear your stories about drug administration and errors that have occurred. And are they addressing the fact that we need improved drug development for this population to improve their outcomes? And if you're a social media person, use opportunities when they arise. So when you see something about neonates on social media, repost it with your comments. And some examples for myself, Dr. Kelsey from the AAP posted a letter on advocacy, and I reposted it, sharing information that the FDA has an interested parties meeting, which is now going to be September 15th, and they're looking for all kinds of stakeholders to share their comments on unmet needs for infants, barriers to clinical trials in the NICUs, what incentives have helped. And so you have opportunities now where with your professional organization that you can reach out, but you can use social media just to keep the conversation going. I think you need to develop a mindset that you're always asking yourself, how can I use this opportunity to advocate for neonates and their families? And, you might think, who am I? I'm just, a nurse in one unit. You know, I don't have a strong following, but that's when you reach out to contacts that you have who might have wider spheres of influence and make them aware of the situation and make them aware of papers that come up where they might repost or use at a speaking conference to inform others and increase the awareness and increase the need for advocacy.
I think it's the volume of the discussion that also matters, not just quality. I think it's one of those areas where quantity also equally matters. Everybody needs to speak up. This is basically my opinion on this.
And like you said, Mary, I think it's really important that we have these relationships and partnerships with NAN, with the INC to help keep this conversation going and help make a bridge between nursing and research and the importance of drug development. And like you said, we start small. You can work on your local NAN chapters. You can come to NAN's website and you can see what we're doing with the INC. And, those partnerships and collaborations, just like we're doing now, really provides a platform where we can create more safety around medication administration, more and ultimately, right, more effective therapies for our neonatal population. And that's why it's so critical that we have these conversations and we encourage nurses to become more active and use their voice, not only in their units, but, outside of those NICU doors and make sure that they're being heard and these babies' stories are being heard, and encouraging parents to also speak up. I think because drug development is a new concept for some nurses, and they might just be hearing about this for the first time, and they feel like it's such a complex idea and too big to really get involved in. What advice would you give them about starting small, but that also making a huge difference?
What I would suggest for them, the places to start, is to focus on unmet medical needs of their patients. Who could possibly know more than the person at the bedside taking care of the patient? Then look for opportunities to share those stories of unmet medical needs with the community. That's where I would start. If there would be one call to action, I would say that you need to develop an advocacy mindset to look at things with the question, does this provide an opportunity to advocate for my patients? And then take some kind of action. And it gets easier with time.
Wakako, do you have any advice for nurses jumping into this arena?
I was initially completely overwhelmed because I felt like I had to understand so many new concepts that I had not been exposed to working in clinical settings because I've never worked for industry or that I've never been invited to be involved in the clinical trials in a big way. Learning something in bits and pieces is completely okay. And I gave myself a chance to be involved in numerous committees or working groups over the course since 2015 to educate myself of what are the discussion topics, what is the gap, what is missing, what is the unmet needs in this category or that category. And I would just encourage anyone who really, especially those who are in settings where clinical trials are going on more frequently, just like Mary said, don't wait till you are given, this is the trial that's going to happen, so you just need to know who are going to be enrolled or who are the eligibility criteria. But find a way that you can be invited to the process, during the process of discussion about the clinical trial details, just because if it involves a baby, it involves a nurse. And you may have certain feelings about this frequency of lab draw for this particular study. This is not going to be conducive to the neurodevelopment or stress factors, or they may overlook, because they're not at the bedside, right? Those people who write may not be at the bedside. And it requires the scrutinizing eyes of the nurses who are at the bedside to provide input. And I think sometimes the nurses feel like we don't know enough to really raise our voice, but be confident that you know a lot. You do know a lot. So the opportunities for nurses are there. And I don't think any physicians or researchers would belittle you if you come up with a sound, experience-based nurse's view of why something may not be appropriate or something may be better. I think that nurses' eyes are very, very important.
Take advantage of the free resources that are available. National Association of Neonatal Nurses and the International Neonatal Consortium have a series of CE courses that are free out on the NAN e-learning page. And as I mentioned, the FDA has lots of resources, so educate yourself as you're developing this advocacy mindset.
Critical Path Institute and INC is also going to be holding one of our own meetings that is going to be attended by all different type of stakeholders, from industry, regulators, FDA, EMA, and other regulators, to academic stakeholders, are basically entirety of our INC's community membership. We are actually going to discuss some of the same issues and challenges with neonatal drug development, why advocacy is lacking in this population, with active testimonials from patients themselves. But that I don't really mean babies are going to be talking, but their parents are going to be talking. And then we're going to have a bunch of discussions about some of the specific work that INC is doing. Our task forces and work groups in various different areas related to safety issues, neonatal adverse event severity scale, how to use NAESS in clinical and drug development setting, and a whole lot of other issues are going to be discussed.
I just want to sincerely thank Mary, Wakako, and Kanwaljit for joining us today. Not only sharing your expertise, but you can feel your passion with this important work. So you've given us a lot to think about. And most importantly, you recognize that the nurse's voice is so important in driving change. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about neonatal drug development, be sure to check out NAN's iLearn site for a free CEU course on Bridging the Gap, Empowering Neonatal Nurses in Drug Development for Neonates. And as always, thank you for your commitment to neonatal nursing and for the difference you make in the lives of babies and families every single day. Make sure you never miss an episode of NANcast by subscribing now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thanks for your support and letting us into your ears. Have a great day.